Hello! Today's stories come from r/entitled people. Today's is a single story that was too spicy and too outrageous to miss. It was reposted by OP a little under a month ago, but it has never been posted to any of the Reddit story sections. The story is entitled Squatter Tried to Steal My Brother's House. Several years ago, my brother Dan moved from California to Washington state and built a 3-bedroom house on one of 2 parcels of land he had bought when he was 18 years old. He lived in a nice community with a small lake and had an HOA. During the 2008 economic crash, he ran into financial trouble, so we helped him. To repay us for the help, in March of 2016, he came down to California for an extended period to work on our house, which was neglected because of helping him. He was very proficient at renovating houses and did fantastic work. In November, my brother's friend Jake called him and asked if a friend of his, Tuna, could stay in one of the rooms for $400 per month. Dan had worked for many years with Jake doing construction for a house flipper, so he trusted Jake's judgment, needed the money, and thought it might be good to have someone trustworthy there to watch his house. Dan drove back up to Washington, cleaned out a room, put a lock on his bedroom door, locked the door, and put some of his things in a storage area up out of the way in the garage. Tuna seemed nice and gave Dan $400 for the first month. There was never a written rental agreement. It was just verbal and meant to be temporary, because Dan was going to return in 6 months. Tuna never sent another payment. We would call and ask her, and she always said it had been sent, but nothing ever arrived. So what was going on at his house? We pieced together that something wrong was going on there after Dan's neighbor called and after questioning Jake. The neighbor complained that the house had turned into a drug house, full of people and cars coming and going all hours of the night. At the beginning of June 2017, Dan drove back to Washington and handed Tuna a 3-day eviction notice. She left, stating that she had somewhere else to live and would get her stuff later. He was allowing her to retrieve her stuff at a later date. He just wanted her out. He started working on repairs and cleaning up the house. I mailed Dan a care package with some clothes, a California-themed shopping bag, and gift cards for gas and food. 5 days later, Tuna showed up with 2 men who punched Dan in the face. They wanted to take the house back by force. Dan went to the neighbor and called the police. The police came, and instead of arresting the men and Tuna, they took Dan to jail for missing a child support court date, which then put a warrant on him. Before coming to California, he thought everything regarding child support back payments for his independent, successful 23-year-old adult child had been taken care of. He had no idea about a court date since they notify by mail, and Tuna had never forwarded his mail, which was one of the things she promised to do. The child support scam on Dan is another issue I will have to submit later. So, the police essentially handed the house over to Tuna. She and her cronies went in, changed the locks, and placed a long metal bar across the inside of the garage door so it could not be opened from the outside. They stole the package I sent to Dan and spent the gift cards. Meanwhile, my family and I were on vacation in Hawaii, and I received a phone call from Dan in jail. I spent a whole day of my vacation in the hotel room trying to figure out how to get him out of jail. Bail bonds could not be used for child support cases. Finally, they let him out when I paid a child support payment of $350. He had been in jail for 3 days, and the squatters had dug themselves in. So when he returned to his house, he had to call the police to arrest them for trespassing. After all, Tuna had been evicted, left, and no longer had permission to be there. They were squatters by all accounts, but the state defers to people who just claim they are renting, therefore requiring a landlord to go through the court system to remove the so-called tenants, who are actually squatters. The police came and screwed him over once again. Tuna claimed she was renting the entire house, and the police believed her instead of Dan. She told the policeman that she would leave in 10 days, and the policeman told Dan that he could have his house back in 10 days, because Tuna said she would leave by then. Are you kidding me? Dan was instructed to leave the premises or be arrested. It was his house. She was trespassing. He got into his minivan and drove away, with nowhere to stay but in his van. Of course, Tuna did not leave after 10 days. Dan went back after 10 days and called the police again. Once again, the police told him to leave or be arrested. We didn't know what to do next. One of the HOA board members who had some experience in managing real estate properties attempted to help us. She said that he needed a 20-day eviction notice, then Tuna would be out. And this had always worked for her when she had to evict tenants. Okay, so the 20-day notice was posted and we waited. Tuna did not leave. Dan went over to his house and started cleaning up trash strewn all over the yard, waiting for her to leave. Tuna called the police, stating that she was a renter and he was disturbing her. Once again, Dan was asked to leave or be arrested. This time, Dan put his phone on speaker, and I heard the whole interaction between him and the police. Yes, he had to leave or be arrested. Dan could not even get his construction tools out of the garage and could not work without his tools. And with being homeless, how do you even work? What was going to happen to all of his possessions, his sentimental things? His room had been broken into long before his things were moved and people had used the room. It was near the end of summer. We were paying his mortgage payments and it was getting so hard on everyone. Then something nice happened. A kind friend, Adam, asked him to stay at his house, which Dan did. During this time, Dan worked for Adam with loan tools and also went to some landlord-tenant educational meetings. The people at the meetings were helpful and instructed Dan on how to proceed by taking the matter to the court. The police would not go further without a court order to physically evict Tuna. It would be difficult to afford the cost to hire a lawyer, but eventually, we did end up getting a lawyer. Dan posted a court appearance on the door of his house, since Tuna never answered the door, and that is what you do legally in this case. Every time he posted a court appearance, he had to legally give her 1 week notice, which he did. He showed up at court and Tuna failed to show up. So he won by default, right? Wrong. The judge said that Tuna was not given proper notice because the notice was posted by Dan instead of an anonymous person. Dan walked out of the courtroom. The lawyers from the landlord-tenant meetings were there and couldn't believe it. Unfortunately, Adam had to move out of his house he was renting, so Dan had to go back to living in his van. It was autumn in the Pacific Northwest and getting cold. The police had started harassing him if he slept in his van. We rented motel rooms for Dan. Once while at a motel, Dan heard a knock on the door in the middle of the night. He thought it was the motel staff and opened the door. 2 men burst into the room and proceeded to beat the crap out of him to rob him. They broke his finger and gave him a concussion. Dan ran to his van, drove it to a parking lot, and slept. He refused to go back to the motel. Things were starting to go downhill in a very bad way. I found a lawyer from a nonprofit who worked for free to help. He actually used that 3-day eviction notice that Dan had given Tuna back in June as a basis for the case. I had found it online, the wording was appropriate, and it had been served properly. The lawyer had to jump through endless hoops and court appearances. The same judge presided over every case that had to do with evictions, and she always favored the tenants, including entitled ones. This took forever, like 3 more months, and Dan became haggard, homeless, sick, depressed, and at times had gone missing. Once I called every hospital, jail, homeless shelter, and even the food bank looking for him. His van was impounded 4 times. He was hospitalized 4 times. He was endlessly hunted down and harassed by the police. 3 times I found him because I was listed as his emergency contact on his state insurance when he showed up at hospitals. While all of this was happening to Dan, my husband was in a serious motorcycle accident, and I had to take care of my husband, changing his dressings, etc. Okay, I'm crying right now. This was so hard to endure, remember, and difficult to write about. I couldn't leave and fly up to Washington to help my brother, but I was doing everything down here to get his house back with the lawyer. I got him motel rooms at other motels when I could. I paid 4 times to get his van out of impound. I sent him cell phones and care packages delivered at UPS stores. One time, Dan was lost and didn't have his van or phone. He ended up at a hospital who contacted me. He told me that he had felt really sick and had gone to the hospital earlier, who released him after examining him, even after he pleaded with them to let him stay because he felt horribly sick. He ended up collapsed on the sidewalk by the Salvation Army shelter, who wouldn't let him in, and another homeless person called 911. So he was back at that hospital with a very serious condition affecting his heart. I told the hospital to please call me at release time so I could arrange a motel for Dan. They didn't. He was then found in a park in frigid weather dressed in a pair of scrubs, a t shirt, hoodie, and one shoe. A city policeman called me and took him to a motel where he stayed a while. I sent a care package there. Dan told me that one time when he was being harassed by the police for cooking food in a park, he mouthed off and told him they were commies and it was their fault that he was homeless because they gave his house to a squatter. A fire truck arrived, so he was not arrested with the firemen there, but I don't think the police liked him much for saying that. In October, Dan was arrested for drunk driving while he was sleeping in a Walmart parking lot. WTF? I had to bail him out of jail over that. Every time he didn't get to court hearings, they would post warrants for his arrest. One time, he was in jail and they refused to give him his medication, so I had to bail him out because he felt so awful. In mid November, the police arrested Dan again for not showing up to court for that so called drunk driving incident. He begged me to bail him out. Even though the bail bondsman paid the bail in the late afternoon, the jail released him in the middle of the night. Again, he had no vehicle, impounded, a dead cell phone, no charger in the van, no money, etc. I found out later that this jail only releases people at night so they can get credit and are paid by the state for the whole day. That night he was released, it was our deceased mother's birthday. Dan was then found unconscious in a ditch by a seawall in a Starbucks parking lot. He had a broken femur, broken hip, cracked spine, a head contusion, and that finger was still broken from the motel incident. The doctors evaluated that he had been hit in the back of his head with a blunt object. We do not know who did it. The last thing he remembers was a police car driving by. He was airlifted to a major hospital in Seattle, about 50 miles from where he was. I took a flight up to Seattle as soon as I could and visited him. The doctor showed me the x-rays, and he had countless rods and pins put into his body to put him back together. By this time, we were getting closer to having his house back. I went by the house with Adam's brother-in-law, Paul, who was packing heat. We pounded on the door, and I demanded that the squatters hand over my dead mother's rocking chair. The stupid friend, Jake, was there, and he handed it through the door. It is a big heirloom mission-style chair, and they had burned into the chair in 4-inch letters the word wasted. The court order finally became available, but then we had to schedule the eviction according to when the police had time to do it, which was another 2 weeks. It was scheduled for the beginning of December. I went back home to California briefly and returned the night of the eviction. Dan was in the hospital for almost 2 weeks. When he was released, I arranged a nice long-term stay-type hotel back near home for him to live at until the police evicted the squatters. Paul helped us a lot. He was with the police at the eviction, changed all the locks, and secured the house. He picked up Dan at the hotel, and Dan got to witness the eviction of that entitled witch from hell. She was the only one left in the house. A notice had been posted on the door to warn everyone to leave, but as usual, she didn't think there would be any reason she would have to leave. It took her completely by surprise. The police pounded on the door and demanded she leave immediately. She asked if she could get this and that, but no, she couldn't. She grabbed her little dog, purse, and left with nothing else. The police put a notice on the door after Paul secured everything. Dan was driven back to the hotel, and then I arrived. I wish I could have seen the eviction, but couldn't get a flight early enough. The neighbors said that a bunch of people came to the house that night pounding on the door trying to get in, but couldn't. They almost called the police, but the people left. We went over there every day for about a week to clean up. Dan was confined to a wheelchair and was on heavy meds, so it was hard. He couldn't help too much, but did his best. The house was a disaster. There was literally 5 tons of garbage in the yards around the house. The trash disposal service was not activated during this time, so they just piled it up around the house. On one side of the house was a huge pillar of trash made out of wire fencing. It was about 8 feet by 8 feet and at least 12 feet high. The front yard was awful with several piles of trash about 4 feet high. Tuna left every single thing in the kitchen, in the cupboards, and rotting food in the pans. The carpets were soaked in dog pee. There were clothes and junk everywhere. There was loads of crushed glass embedded into the gravel driveway like she wanted us to get flat tires. Over the doorway from the house into the garage was a dangerous booby trap, which literally could have killed someone. It was made out of large, heavy metal clamps with a glass jewelry case teetering on top of the clamps. It could have fallen on top of someone's head if not discovered and someone jarred it a little. The water had been shut off for months by the HOA because they controlled the well and owned the water system. As soon as you don't pay the HOA fees, water is shut off. All the toilets were clogged up with human waste. The sewage system was impossible to unclog, and later, Dan discovered that they had thrown dirt and plastic containers down the pipes. They had to go under the house and disassemble the pipes to get everything out. Hanging up on the wall in plain sight in the master bedroom was the California shopping bag I had mailed to Dan in the package that Tuna had stolen. She hung it there to taunt me. I am not super religious, but I felt the worst kind of evil there and had to pray and rebuke the evil spirits from that house. I stayed for weeks there cleaning up and hired some people to do yard cleanout to get the front yard clean. Later, Dan and Adam dealt with the pillar of trash at the side of the house. Every construction tool that belonged to Dan was stolen. He couldn't work much from a wheelchair, but needed the tools to repair his own house. Dan persisted, though. He finally got to the point where he could walk. Now, he can't walk for long periods, gets tired easily, but can do things slowly. He has some nice roommates that drive him places and take care of him at times. Many of his tools were replaced. He sanded off the wasted note on Mom's rocking chair. We have sunk a lot of money into helping him, but what else is one supposed to do? It was a life or death situation. That was his house he had built so many years ago. This was the most wicked thing I have ever encountered. It was coming from all directions. We heard that creepy squatter died a year later. No one wanted to take her in, and she went from person to person staying wherever. If she would have been decent and kind, she probably could have been a roommate and had a place, but she thought she could just take someone's house. That was painful. Poor OP's brother and OP. Tuna left a ton of destruction in her wake, and what an apt name. The visceral response that one has to the disgusting and pervasive stink of tuna. You know, the kind that lingers in your nose. It's really fitting for this story. I mean, the injury and bodily harm that OP's brother suffered as a result of Tuna and her lackeys are really horrifying. Not to mention the fact that he couldn't turn to anybody. It's so sad. Let's check out the comments where OP stuck around to answer questions and provide extra details. Any Bridge said, Jesus, what a piece of human excrement. It's stories like these that show why overhauls of laws, police, and judges are needed on occasion. Potater added, police and judge were co-conspirators in this case. Any Bridge replied, sounds like a conflict of interest. OP added, we did suspect that often. You wouldn't believe what a hard time they gave his lawyer, who followed all the protocol to the T. Someone wanted his house, and we weren't sure it was even the squatter. Malonsky-chan said, what the heck was that person thinking by recommending that crazy woman stay in his house? Always get a tenancy agreement. Never rent to people without gold references from multiple places. OP replied, yep, she fooled them both. He did not use the smart legal path for a rental. Didn't want to bother. But she did move out when he handed her the 3-day eviction notice. As far as we were concerned, coming back almost a week later, having 2 men assault him, and taking a house you were no longer living in, with the police helping them do so, is completely illegal as far as we were concerned. I can name charges like assault, trespassing, etc. But the police chose to take my brother to jail for missing a child support hearing. He had taken care of this issue, but they had misfiled the paperwork. Punctual Zombie said, speak to a local journalist or news station. This story is horrific and unbelievable. OP replied, I have reached out to a Washington guy named Sean Reynolds, who has a news channel on YouTube and podcasts called News for Reasonable People that covers things of this nature. It would be great if he could cover the story. I have emailed him photos, which do say 1,000 words. Michigakur said, well, you pretty much described how we lost my grandma's house. Cousin let his druggy friend stay. Cousin ended up almost dying in a traffic accident. Ironically, Cousin became an opioid addict after the accident. While Cousin was recovering, we tried to remove Druggy, who lied and said he had a rental agreement with Cousin, who did not own the house. House was in a trust. Took us nearly a year in total to completely remove Druggy and his friends through legal means. By that time, they had literally ripped it down to a shell. Anything inside was either gone or destroyed. OP said, wow, I am so sorry. What state was that in? This was in Washington state. Michigakur said, Michigan, Detroit to be exact. It's gotten easier and yet sometimes harder to evict. If you've enjoyed the story and would like to hear more, consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Thanks, and bye for now.